In the next part of the session, I'd like to invite our distinguished speakers from the IPCC to join a panel session, a Q&A session to include all of you, together again with Mr. Shun from the Hong Kong Observatory. If you perhaps come to take a seat at the high chairs. I think in this session, with everybody's permission, what I might try and do is perhaps to start with a little sort of recap, test whether my notes are any good on what we've heard this morning, but then quickly think about what this means for business. So that's what we'll get into in this stage. If you do have questions, please just put up your hand and the microphones will find you. Thank you. Great. So I'm going to start. This might be foolish, but going back to the first slide this morning to make sure I understood this. And Professor Jai, your slide was very clear. Human-induced climate change, or human activity, has caused the planetary temperature to go up by approximately 0.9 degrees. That's your conclusion from reading the research. I just want to play the skeptic for a moment. Sometimes we read that there might be other causes for climate change. In the thousands of research reports that I know you read, are there such other theories that are credible?
Actually, that's depend on time scale, or the spatial scale. Say for one place, one small place like a region or like Hong Kong, a lot of factors influence the weather and the climate here, because there is you have energy, exchange from region by region. But globally, in my slide, mainly cause is one is from change of solar radiation, and another is from volcanic activity. And then from the Industrial Revolution, the emissions, and also we have land use, and that's all we call that external, forces. And also inside the system, there is something like changing, like ocean warming, like El Nino, La Nina, also can change the weather and the climate, but in different time scale, like. El Nino, La Nina mainly based on year-to-year change.
Yes.
And for the solar radiation, you don't see much change throughout. Already included in my slide, you see the curve, the red one. Not much change throughout the past century. I think less than 1%. I think of the change, very, very small change. But from when talk about, more than 10,000 years, the whole human history, or longer than that, that's another story.
Yes.
Because the change in the position of for the sun and the earth, then changing the radiation. But in the in the recent human history, main cause is human activity. We are very clear, but the time scale we talk about is decades to century scale.
Yes.
So
if I understand you correctly, you're saying there are other factors, but broadly over the timescales that we're looking at, they sort of net each other off, so that most of the 0.9 can be and is explained.
Yeah, we call that attributable to human activities.
Okay.
It's we can say it's likely or with a high confidence, because not only by we have observation, you see the change, we have model to prove that if you remove the human activity, you don't see such change. And you put on the human drivers, you see the increasing as exactly as the warming, the trend we observed, and say much more information there, and also based on the theory,
Yes.
a process we understand.
That's very clear, thank you. Now, the next question I was going to ask, you answered earlier, somebody at the back answered what I think is a very good question. What happens if we go cold turkey on greenhouse gases today? So we go to 0 CO2, we go to 0 methane, and I think you answered that would, then we'd expect the temperature to rise a bit because of the lag, and we'd settle somewhere at 1.1 to 1.2 degrees. Although I was a little bit nervous because I think then Dr. Portner made a comment that in the next set of reports that there might be some acknowledgement that we may have slightly underestimated where these temperatures will go. But I'll leave that for the moment and sort of wanted to ask the other, or please, yes.
Yeah, I was referring to sea level rise going
yeah.
on as a long-term commitment,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
the ice systems,
Yeah.
the cryosphere is not in
Yes.
equilibrium with the temperatures,
Yeah.
the changing temperatures.
I want to add, say the whole Earth system, they also have a lot of plants, trees, that can absorb 1/3 of annual emission from the human being. So that means if we stop emission, they can take some, still can take some from the system to reduce the accumulative emission a little bit. You know.
Yes, okay. So follow-on question to that then is thinking about what's happening to emissions today, and the bad news seems to be that they're not declining and actually they're going up slightly. So if I take a optimistic assumption, and let's assume they're flat line, CO2 and methane, what does your assessment, what is the scientific opinion on then at what point or in how many years do we have before, under that scenario, we're then committed to 2 degrees or more?
Say which the level of because we're talking about emission, we have two, one is for we have annual emission.
Yes.
If we increase year by year.
Yeah,
so if we can peak this, then add constant, the amount to the atmosphere. That's one account. Yeah. Another one is cumulative.
Yes.
Emission. That's something balanced. That's
yes.
something like net zero, we call that.
So I'm talking about annual emissions. So 40 gigatons per annum of CO2, and we flatline at that level. How many years is it before we've got 2 degrees C baked in?
For 2 degrees C?
Yes.
I would say, say for 1.5 degrees C is 2050, I think about 2070. About 2070 will be 2 degrees C, yeah.
Please.
It's already baked. Yeah, in fact, I could add that to that if we base on the current commitment by the government to reduce the emissions, then it's highly likely that by the end of the century we will still see a 3-degree increase.
Yes.
That's based on the current.
Yeah. Say, based on Paris Agreement, we have a national dedicated contribution.
Yeah.
So put them together. Say what we agreed. Then if follow what we promised, then we are heading for 3 degrees C at the end of 21st century.
Right.
Not far from the 1.5 degrees C target.
And where, if we look at measures of concentrations, would we be at that point? If we're at 408 parts per million CO2 today, where is that 2 degrees C threshold if measured in greenhouse gas concentrations?
So even for 2 degrees C, say if we over, say something like Hans already talked, for 1.5 degrees C reach net zero 2050, and then for 2 degrees C 2070, past this, then you will over temperature over than 2 degrees C. If over that, then you have to take the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, then find another solution.
Right. My question was slightly different. Is there a concentration of CO2 that we can see as a sort of a threshold level to associate with 2 degrees C?
Oh, there is some, can convert to this.
Yeah.
Now it's about over 412, something like this.
And where does it have to get to? Where does that concentration get to such that we would then know, because to your earlier point, because the CO2 has a very long life in the atmosphere, that we are committed to 2 degrees C or beyond?
450.
I don't know exactly.
It's I mean, there's always an uncertainty range.
Yeah,
It's not a
450
close
is double,
calibration
something
curve,
like
right?
Double the emission compared with pre-industrial level. 450, no, 280. Then.
Okay, and the reason I'm asking is because, and please do ask, because thinking to...
I mean, just to, I'm not really sure what you're getting at, but there is no added value by sort of speculating about a scenario where we keep emissions constant.
Yes.
Because the current economic dynamics and growth indicate that emissions will grow. We are seeing a decoupling of economic growth and emissions currently,
Yes.
but it's not sufficient to say we have reached the peak and now it can go down.
Yes.
Because that must be our concern. And even the current NDCs, the national determined contributions by countries, take emission reductions into account. And even then, with insufficient emission reductions below the current rate, we will reach 3 degrees by the end of century.
Yes.
With a range of uncertainty around it. And just to say, I mean, the currently, Pamao can certainly expand more on this, the current climate physics in the CMIP6 model generation, there are some models that consider that the climate, so-called climate sensitivity, the response of climate to carbon emissions, is underestimated and may be higher. So with the current emissions we may, or with the current CO2 levels, we may get stronger warming than we think.
Yes. Yes.
So there are uncertainties, right?
Of course. But the very clear message is a call to urgent action.
Yes.
For the benefits and to
bring it down.
And to bring that down. Just if I may, to comments you made, Dr. Portner, about, and we'll come away from the severe scenarios and talk about hopefully where we might go. But you talked about a 4 degree C world and a great swathe of the sort of the central band of the planet becoming uninhabitable or unusable for cultivation. What might that mean, and does your assessment look at actually how many people might be displaced? How big is the sort of the migration if we were to unfortunately get to those extremes? Just to put some context to the outer.
Yeah, there are some projections there where according in relation to scenarios like the RCP 2.6, the 4.5, which takes us a little bit beyond 2, and the 6.5, and then 8.5. That the area where that is no longer amenable for human life without air condition will be expanding. And there are places on the planet that are concerned with this. This is the Persian Gulf area, which has high humidity closer to shore. It is the Amazon that is concerned. It is Southeast Asia that is involved. And so there are these places where we get conditions that are hostile to higher life. There is no animal life on land beyond 45 degrees body temperature. This is true for all animals. We find it difficult to live beyond 40 body temperature, and we are sick when this occurs. So there are, and for plant life, the temperature limits are a little bit higher, but which just emphasizes that for the complex life forms that have resulted during evolutionary history, these developments were possible because the planet had friendly temperatures for that.
Yes.
We cannot isolate us from the temperature regime of the planet.
No, thank you. That's very clear, because one of the things that is happening in the world of finance and investment is requests or looking at scenarios and looking at climate scenarios, temperature scenarios. And I don't want to over-interpret what you've said, Professor Morton, but it seems as though from what you're describing there, a 4 degrees C scenario is just so different from the world that we know today that perhaps it isn't even worth doing the economic modelling at that temperature, because we're going to see such big fundamental disruptions and because through loss of ecosystem services. Is that a fair observation?
You will get a lot of strong warning signals, because if you let climate change go on unabated, in the end you pay much more money for the damages than you would pay now for moving into a strong climate mitigation.
Okay.
It's just not an option.
Yes.
It's not reasonable to take that in.
No. No. And that's really what I was hoping to establish. Let's just accept it, put that one to one side, and focus where we need to be going. And Mr. Shun, you thinking of sort of some Hong Kong local impacts, and I think PW gave a very good presentation on these. But thinking of that sort of storm surge scenario in Hong Kong, is your estimate that I think we talked about you talked about Mangkhut becoming the every year scenario
by the end of this century. Yeah.
By the end of this century, so if Mangkhut is the every year, what then does the 1 in 100 years look like?
That's a good question.
How big is that, and what's the impact of that?
Now, first of all, if we look back, not to look further first, look back in our history, Hong Kong has been affected by a number of really severe typhoons, bringing very severe storm surge. In 2 cases, we had deaths of more than 10,000, 1937, 1906. And in 1874, there was one killing 8% of the population of Macau because of storm surge. Hong Kong, there was we haven't yet got new territories, so we had casualties, deaths of several thousand, all because of storm surge. So with this, then so it is totally feasible to have such historical storms repeating. For example, in the 1874 storm, we have reanalysis of the case based on historical data, storm surge modeling. We end up with the figure of 5 meters above the reference level chart data we call for the Victoria Harbour. This means that, as PW has shown, quite a number of low-lying areas in our central surrounding the 2 sides of the Victoria Harbour will be flooded. So that's the baseline. Without climate change, without sea level rise. So if we talk about the sea level rise of the order of a meter, well, of course, this is assuming a high level of continuing the business as usual. By the end of the century, we have 1 meter increase, then we are talking about 6 meters, right? So that's even more flooding.
And what does even more mean? Does that Central is closed down, or we just lost certain
it really
properties?
depends on our adaptation measures by the time.
Right.
So if we do nothing, then probably we will see more than meters of floodwater above the Walls Road, Connaught Road. So you can imagine what scenario we will be getting at. And that has not yet been taken into account of the scenario of a real super typhoon landing over Hong Kong.
Right.
Making landfall, for example, slightly to our west, then it will be bearing the full brunt of the storm surge and the huge waves. And that's in that scenario, coupled with sea level rise, probably we'll be expecting something like 7 meters in certain areas. So, as I understand, our infrastructural design is based on 7 meters in certain, for example, the power stations, the airport. Yeah, so we are getting close to the limit. to seeing some major disruption under those scenarios. Of course, this is business as usual. If we do much more to contain the emission to 1.5 or 2 degrees, then we may not get as much. But still, because of the carbon dioxide emissions already committed certain level zero rise, we will see 5 meters storm surge or even close to 6 in the future. That is already appearing in our history. So no reason to believe that it will not recur again.
Let me give you some more extreme reference points where you consider what the system and what the capacity of the global system is for change. All the ice that is available in glaciers and ice sheets on the planet, if you melt it all, and the capacity is there, if we use all fossil fuel, it has been modeled, then we would melt all ice. And we would get 65 meters of sea level rise. So we're still good for 65 meters. This is the extreme reference point.
Yes.
It's unrealistic with current policies, yes, but it gives you a feeling for how uncertain we are with respect to saying, oh, is there half a meter or 10 centimeter more? How certain we can be about what a certain degree of warming actually does to the cryosphere, especially since this is a long-term response. We do not know the tipping point when things will be accelerating, where it is, at which global temperature, whether it's 1.5 or 4 or 3, and so forth. So there are uncertainties. But all of this kind of thinking in the context of these extreme references, these have been in place during Earth's history. The last interglacial, 120,000 years ago, had 7 to 8 meters higher sea level than pre-industrial, at temperatures that we are having now. Okay, the position of the Earth was a little different, and polar and tropical temperatures were a little different, so it's not fully comparable. But then the last time the planet had 400 ppm CO2 in the atmosphere, 3 to 5 million years ago, it had 7+ meters higher sea level. So it's something we are headed for, and it's a warning signal which would encourage us to use a precautionary approach and not trigger the system more than we actually need to.
Yes. So let's try and bring that down to the businesses represented in the room. So what does that mean? And I'll come back to you, Mr. Shum. We've talked about, we might just be okay at, or we're planning to be okay for that sort of, the next wherever Mancook gets to going forward. But what about other impacts? And in the storms, things like wind speeds, because it seems wind does a lot of damage. Because we talked about storms becoming more intensive, even if the frequency doesn't necessarily go up. But how much more intensive are they getting, and when do we start to approach the design parameters of all of these wonderful single glazed, Robert, thank you, single glazed buildings like this one?
Yeah, indeed, we are a part of the study that the government is doing is exactly on this point. Actually, we received some questions from developers asking about whether the building code today is sufficient. The building code today on the wind is based on the recorded worst scenario in the past, i.e. the Typhoon Wanda in 1962 and also the 1937 typhoon. So those were the reference. But obviously, if we do get the super typhoon landing over Hong Kong, we need to I think upgrade the building code. But that is being studied by consultants based on the experience from other countries, based on the climate model projections. So we will have the answers in about a year's time. Right. Of course, apart from the wind speed, we will have concern about the heavy rain because as you can just saw from the news about the typhoon in Japan, You can see record-breaking rainstorm nowadays are quite frequent. We talk about 900 millimeters in a day, which is not experienced before, and that's entirely feasible today. And we have a very good infrastructure. The government has done a lot of good work to divert the rainwater before the rainwater reach the central business areas. We also have a good drainage system. But in case of this kind of record-breaking rainstorm comes, then still we will expect quite a number of flooding and also landslide. For this landslide part, our colleagues in the geotechnical engineering office also doing a lot of work because for the work so far in the past decades, since the 1970s, we have done a great job in enhancing the slopes safety for the artificial slopes. For example, just look outside the window. But because of the heavier and heavier rainfall rate expected actually occurring, and also expected in the climate change scenarios, the concern on the stability of the natural slope is also increasing. The natural slope being that those not having man-made slopes. So those could be a concern for the future. Right. So that's we also need to be aware that we have, for example, in 2008, we have a rainstorm, black rainstorm, really heavy rain over Lantau Island. There was a landslide with a fetch of 2 kilometers. From the start of the landslide to the end, we talk about 2 kilometers run.
That was in PW's photograph, I think.
Yeah. And so that's over Lantau. So if it is occurring over here, you can imagine. So that's a real concern, and our engineering departments are working on this to plan ahead.
Yes. So we've clearly got current impacts that are very significant. If we look ahead in those scenarios where we don't do anything, the extremes are almost so extreme they're not worth talking about. So it appears, Dr. Jai, you've sort of done your job here in getting us to the point where we now know what's causing it, and in a sense, all we're left really doing is we're modelling pathways, but really the only credible ones are the ones where we have very rapid emissions reductions. And it's almost like we don't need RCP 8.5 anymore because it's just a world that's not worth considering. Is that sort of where you've got to, Professor Jai, on the the climate science and what's driving warmings?
Because the first figure I show is telling the main warming throughout the century is caused by the human activity, mainly because of the carbon dioxide emission.
Yes.
And the future pathway is more linked to the socio-economic development and the society, the whole society, how many people, what type of life we're going to have in the future. So in R6, in R5, we use a very theoretical, the term to express the emission pathway called RCP, which link to radiative forcing, because we call that radiative forcing, concentration pathway,
right,
which is linked to the emissions. And for AR6, we use as SSP, shared social economic pathway, more linked to the social, society and economic development. Say we do not take action, maybe say that maybe business as usual, then will be RCP 8.5. That means human activity add something like 8.5, the units of the heat, add to the climate system. Because you add more than the solar gave us, the energy. And if you limit to the lowest one in the AR5, something RCP 2.6, this is something add 2.6 the radiative forcing, the unit to the system, that you can reduce this. But now seem to us the track we are following is in between.
Yes.
So even not, but not obviously not the RCP 8.5, because human being is taking action. We have more renewable energy using, and more the technical improvement, save the energy consumption.
Yes.
A lot, and also have a lot of other activities. But for RCP, even for RCP 2.6, which is more linked to the 2-degree warming, so still there is some distance, and not mentioned for 1.5 degrees C. That means something like RCP 1.9, which was not existed for AR5,
right.
will be appear in next assessment report.
That's even more aggressive.
Even more, yeah.
Yes.
Based on our report for 1.5 degrees C warming, say if we want to reach global warming in 1.5, but by the end of this century, then you have to reduce the emission 45% by 2030. To think only more than 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years. Yes. Do you think what action we're going to take to reduce 45% globally?
Yes. I've got one small follow-on, then I'll come to you, Magnus. Just in those forcings, what's the relative contribution between CO2 and methane? Is there, because it's from the SR 1.5, because of the short half-life of methane in the atmosphere, it seems if we cut that back, we can actually generate some cooling impacts, whereas because of the long life of CO2, we can't. Is there as we start to come to then think about governance, is there something there we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think more knowledge is on carbon dioxide. For methane, now we start to work on this. In AR6, we are trying to working on, say, other non-CO2 forces. Because, as Hans said, the other non-CO2 climate drivers, we could also can bring the co-benefits, such as, because when you use coal, at one side you release carbon dioxide, at the other side you release the black carbon or other aerosol, which is pollutants.
Cooling.
Yeah, cause the human, also influence our human health. So for other drivers, I think they also have some scenario, but not the understanding is less than compared with.
And methane, just for the avoidance of doubt, and I expect that most people know. I mean, that's really about our food supply. It's about livestock as well as fugitive methane from energy.
Compared with carbon dioxide, methane is short-lived climate force. Its lifetime is shorter than 10 years. So, but for carbon, say immediately if you take action, methane, then you can contribute very quickly, but not for carbon dioxide.
So go vegan. Yes, Jean. Oh, Magnus, sorry, did you want to ask Magnus first, and then we'll come to Jean?
If you don't mind, I would like to ask a question, but I need to phrase it in a way that it really is a question and not. It's a question and not a statement.
And to make it concise, Magnus.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
So, as you know, Jonathan, I've been a 60-meter guy. We need to model for 60 meters for a couple of years now. So nothing I heard today surprised me. In fact, it remains fairly modest what you're projecting. I think that although I'm now inured to this catastrophe that we're sailing into, it's the Titanic. The biggest single danger is despair. This is something that at first sight seems, what on earth can we do? You've said it yourself, 4 degrees, let's give up, no point. But I think what we need to do is and here's my question, when can the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank host another event which is the upside? Because this has been seriously down, and for many people who are not aware of this stuff, and I think most of you already are, seriously, deeply, suicidally depressing, I would say. And I think part of the problem in Hong Kong today is that the kids know that we're sailing into an iceberg. So my question is, when can you do one that's all about the amazing engineering technology and the spirit
Yes.
of innovation, not only young people, but old scientists at MIT and Stanford and in Beijing? Let's hear the good news, because we're very near to the end of this session and there's no time for good news. So when's the next event, please?
Yes.
That's the question.
Well, Magnus, firstly, thank you for endorsing our events, and thank you for suggesting for future events. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we have here, and as Robert said very clearly in the earlier sessions, we have the scientists who are talking about where we are on climate change, what the impacts are, and we'll start to come to your next point, because I think that's where Professor Ortner was going in his talk about governance and policy and what we need to do. But Jean, perhaps before we move on to that, please ask your question.
Yeah, I just had a question. So we need everything and anything we can just try to reduce as much as possible. So therefore, I wanted to ask a question about water vapor. The role of water vapor in greenhouse gas warming, how it's included in the models. Okay. And the reason why I'm asking is, anything we can do, if even from a business angle, does it mean we should be taking water out of the air? Does that help with the whole situation as well? So okay. just a question.
Yeah, I can do it first. Water vapor is the largest greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So if without water vapor, then the temperature on the Earth system, the surface will drop drop 18 degrees, something like that level. So water vapor is very important natural greenhouse gases. But what we have is human. You released more and more to the atmosphere. They add 1 degree more. The water vapor in the model is naturally designed, because when you have a warmer climate, they have more evaporation. Then in the atmosphere, you have more water vapor. This, we call that a feedback. So that's internal, not a external driver. So that's already included in the whole system.
Yes. Does that answer your question, Jean? Deborah, I think we might be having another question on water coming up, perhaps?
Yes and no. One for Mr. Sun. Just want to clarify, when you were talking about the 5 meter and the possible 7 meter sea level rise from storm surge from Hato. You said it's from the chart datum, so that doesn't include tide, right?
Yeah, chart datum, yes.
Okay, so probably another 2.5 meters on top of that if it was high tide, if it arrived at high tide. Am I roughly?
No, including the tide.
Yeah. What would the number be?
Of course, the effect of the storm surge on a specific case will depend on the timing. So if it happens to be low tide, then we are safe. Yeah.
And high tide, it's probably about another 2 meters to the low tide. What is the Hong Kong band?
The high tide could get up to, normally 2.5, in certain cases 2.6, 2.7.
I have another. Thank you. And I have another question that's not related to water for the gentleman over there, the two professors. We talked about Paris Agreement, and you also talked about transport and international shipping and so on. We all know that international shipping as well as aviation is not in there. So how does the growth or not pledges related to that at the moment affect the projections?
I think this is not a... I don't think it's included for our scenario, for the pathways, but it's I think mainly for the impact, because in the future, when you have the more melting in the Arctic sea ice, then you have more opportunity maybe for shipping and transportation, but for international shipping, for the emissions, they're not much included, I think.
But the point being, they're not included in the Paris Agreement, but these emissions, total emissions, are included in your modelling of future temperature warmings. Yes,
they are in the global assessment, definitely, and certainly decarbonizing those sectors is important, needs to be done, and is a major industrial challenge. And the way this is going, that's maybe it's seen to different levels in different regions. For my own country, I can say there's a push and there's research going into the direction of synthetic fuels. So having excess renewable energy available to hydrolyze water, take the hydrogen, and then convert CO2, reuse the CO2 and convert it into hydrocarbons of different lengths would provide the fuel for aviation and for shipping. And it's again a matter of dimension. The technology is there, it's very costly, and it's very energy demanding. So it needs the kind of transformation in the energy system to bring us into a better future. But it is a perspective which I think personally is positive, and if we are really pushing there, that would be good. Actually, I have a question now. After all that you've heard from us, how is the banking sector positioning itself?
Yeah, that was my third question, but thank you for asking.
Well, I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative because there's one more question to come from the audience. But maybe let's take these two questions from the audience, and I'm very happy to share my perspective on what a bank would do it at the end, and I would do that willingly in front of, for example, our regulators who are in the room, who also have a very keen interest in what a bank's doing in terms of both mitigating the risks they face and also playing their part in the societal challenge. But I don't want you to have to listen to me. I'd rather have the other two questions, and anyone who wants to talk to me can do that afterwards. So, question here and a question from David over there. David, you go, as you've got the microphone, possession being 9/10, so you go first.
Well, putting aside, is this working?
We can.
Putting aside what Hong Kong might or might not be doing in terms of technical mitigation about things like rising sea levels or storm surges, it does seem to me that in the not too distant future we're going to have to face the fact that global governments are going to have to make some quite draconian decisions that are going to impact on lifestyle. Lifestyles that the majority of developed countries have got very used to over the last 50 years. I think somebody mentioned beef cattle. We know the problems there. Hong Kong, in fact, consumes more beef per head of population than any other place in the world. It's often said in Hong Kong that business couldn't function unless people were able to go in and out through the airport every day. So the amount of flights is just staggering. So the obvious question is, are we able to really combat the public mood, the public aspirations that are going to prevail, I think, unless there really are some very strong global decisions.
Peter, I think that's a great question. That does come to Professor Portner's comments on governance and blockers. But perhaps before we take that, David, let's have a final question from you.
Yeah. Assuming all these mitigating measures of reducing gas emissions fail, okay, and the average temperature goes up by 3 or even 4 degrees, and then we know that there will be disasters. A lot of people might be dying. That will reduce the population and human activities. Okay?
Yeah.
So just an assumption that we cannot control the temperature. As a result, the human activities will be reduced and carbon dioxide emission will also be reduced. So my question is, based on the current theories and modeling, will the Earth restore itself to the temperature, pre-industrial temperatures, or will we be reaching a point of no return? That's basically my question.
Sorry, I don't think there is such scenario in the modeling. Thank you for coming. Yeah.
Certainly the biosphere has the capacity to survive. It may not include us, but it would include other less complex species that are tolerant to more extreme environmental conditions. If you think of the evolutionary history of the planet, it's it's a close interaction between the biosphere and the physics and the atmosphere and how it has evolved. I mean, the composition of the atmosphere has been generated by life on the planet, by life forms on the planet. And the sustainability of life on the planet depends on the presence of the oceans, depends on the ocean currents and the living conditions that we enjoy in the different regions of the planet represent the last 8,000 years of Earth's history, which were able to maintain suitable living conditions and stable climates. Now, we are taking the risk to disturb that balance. And whether this balance, whether planet Earth will be able to sort of come back to that balance in the end after we have left the surface of the Earth with our activities, that is a good question to ask. Probably it will be a somewhat different world, but there will be still some biosphere remaining.
There'll be a conference of cockroaches discussing in 300 years' time. We're over time, so but maybe you could conclude just on those. You started to ask me the question on blockers, and if you want to turn that back to me, that's fine. But obviously, you're suggesting policymakers, you're making the case, you're pressing the urgency, you're providing them ideas. That all comes out in all of your reports. But there seem to be blocks. And do you think perhaps you should be turning the question and the appeal to the business sector and the sort of people who are present in this room? Could this be a more effective group to actually address some of these issues?
I must say there are a diversity of responses that are emerging also from the business sector. Sometimes interactions I've been in tell me that some business people are keen to get moving on something and do something. But what they need to wait for is that their governance sets the right set of conditions and framings for business to allow them to be competitive under these new conditions. Germany has just passed the so-called climate package, which involves a climate law. Some people say it's a minuscule package, but it has some elements in it that actually can be strengthened. One element is a carbon price, where per ton of CO2 there will be a cost that will be imposed, and they're starting with 10 euros per ton, which is virtually ineffective. Economists recommend to start with something like 50 or 60 euros per ton of CO2, and this will be the kind of overarching impact on the economic system that we need to direct investments, financial flows, and so forth. And also there should be a removal of subsidies from fossil fuels. So fossil fuels need to be competitive in their own right in the system. So these overarching framing that needs to come, the incentives needs to come from economic policy. But the policymakers need to be courageous to implement that. And they are, at the moment, it seems they are skittish to implement anything like that because they are concerned that there may be so many forces in society that are pushing back on any constraints. Certainly a CO2 price with societal compensation is the strongest model that is currently under discussion.
But isn't there if we need the policy to drive the change and we're not getting the policy, so we're not getting the change, are you just painting the picture that David was painting of the 4-degree C world? Because the question I would ask, and again, very conscious of time, to everybody in the room, in the business world, is do we need government policy before we start to think about whether my physical asset in location X is actually going to become unusable, and therefore suffer a substantial diminution in value? Do we need a government policy to tell us that consumers, they don't want to buy goods that have got high carbon embedded in them, and therefore to think, well, I need to change my business model if I want to keep selling products? Do we need governments? Does anybody would like to?
Can I maybe give you just as a start?
Yeah.
I think what clearly the research has shown that has been done, we do not need just a response. We need enough of a response. We need to reach the scale of what is needed.
Yes.
So these emission pathways that take us to 1.5, or at least to significantly below 2 degrees, need to be understood as hard guardrails.
Yeah.
And that is something that is difficult to get into the brain of some people. So everybody needs to join forces. Yes, business can do their own thing, clearly, but the question is whether it's enough.
Yeah.
And it seems, based on what we see in Western societies, at least, it's not enough. And so the governance framing is a precondition for things to happen fast enough.
Well, I think that's a very good place to conclude the formalities. Whatever we're doing, it's not enough. So there's a challenge for us to leave the room and try and do some more, because it seems if we don't, the consequences are pretty clear. There doesn't seem to be any debate left around that. So on that thought, hopefully not too pessimistic, Magnus, but a call to action, and there are solutions. We haven't focused on those today, you're right, but I think we've heard quite a few areas, and we know amongst us that there are some areas, but we'll pause there. We have the room for a few more minutes, so please do stay for a few more minutes and to have a conversation if you'd like to. But if you agree with me that we've had, through the whole of this morning, not just in this session, an absolutely extraordinarily unique opportunity to hear from, talk to, ask our questions to the people who know more about the science that is undoubtedly driving the climate challenge, and you'd like with me to show your appreciation to all of these gentlemen, please do join me. Thank you.